For this portion, we're going to talk about reflexes. And when we talk about reflexes here, we're talking about autonomic reflexes, which are involuntary. This is not, the ability to catch a ball really quickly or, catch a fly out of the air with chopsticks. These are things like the knee-jerk reflex, which you don't have any control over. They're involuntary. All reflexes are going to have similar properties. The first is it takes some stimulus to get the response going. So no reflex happens without some stimulus to start what we call the reflex arc. The reflex response is really, really fast. And part of that is because very few neurons in it are involved. In some cases, as few as 2. In some cases, we have a sensory neuron directly synapsing with a motor neuron. The response is always the same. It's pre-programmed. And so you will get the same response every single time. And the response is involuntary. You cannot stop the reflex response. That's the difference between an involuntary and a voluntary reflex. Okay, so if somebody taps your patellar ligament when your foot is swinging free, your quadriceps muscle will contract and your knee will jerk out, your foot will jerk out. That's your knee jerk reflex, and that's going to happen even if you try to stop it. As long as that foot is hanging free, that muscle, the quadriceps muscle, will contract and your foot will go flying out, regardless of whether you want to or not. The reflex arc, which is what we call this pathway, starts with a stimulus, in this case a pin in the skin. The nerve impulse travels through the sensory neuron to the spinal cord. It synapses, in this case, with an interneuron. They don't all involve an interneuron, but this one does. And notice this has axon collaterals, one that's going to synapse with a motor neuron, one that is going to relay the information to the brain. And then the motor neuron carries the impulse to the effector, in this case a muscle that quickly withdraws the hand. So that this is our withdrawal reflex, so when you touch something hot or sharp, you quickly withdraw your hand to avoid injury. The fastest and shortest pathway for a reflex is called a monosynaptic reflex. Monosynaptic literally meaning one synapse. The monosynaptic reflex involves 2 neurons, a sensory neuron, which is like a stretch receptor. This is the stretch receptor shown in the quadriceps muscle. It gets a really fast stretch in response to a tap to the patellar ligament. That neuron synapses directly with a motor neuron. So there's one synapse, monosynaptic, in this reflex. And the motor neuron then goes to the muscle, which is the effector organ, contracting that muscle and causing the foot to swing out. So the knee jerk is the most well-known of the monosynaptic reflexes. And it has to do with these stretch receptors that are in every single muscle. So this is a kind of a cool thing about our muscles, that they do have this sense for when they're being stretched and a reflex to contract the muscle in response to that stretch. So there's these things called spindles inside the skeletal muscles. And these are going to respond to stretch of the muscle fibers. And they're going to send that sensory information to say, hey, the muscle is being stretched. The reflex response to that is to contract the muscle to prevent overstretching of the muscle, which might tear the muscle. If you've ever tried to stretch a muscle and had it feel like it was trying to pull back, then you've experienced this response to that stretch. One of the things that happens when you hold a stretch is that you essentially override the contraction response, essentially telling the muscle, no, it's okay to stretch. So there's a reflex responds to a really fast contraction, but there is a different response to a slow contraction. And that response can actually be down-regulated, meaning that you can get less of a contraction response when you do a slow contraction of a muscle. Now, a polysynaptic reflex has more than one synapse. So we don't have, bisynaptic or anything. We just go from mono to poly. And in this case, so we have, here's a sensory receptor with the hand, for some reason, in a Bunsen burner. Pro tip, don't do that. And the sensory neuron sends the signal, ouch, flame, that goes to an interneuron, and then the interneuron sends that information to a motor neuron, which goes to the effector organ, in this case the muscle, that causes a withdrawal. So this withdrawal reflex is a really common polysynaptic reflex. There are also more complex reflexes, such as the crossed extensor reflex. So that imagine stepping on either a Lego or, say, a cell phone charger. That hurts. You're going to want to step back and get the weight off that foot that stepped on the Lego. And so the reflex itself needs an interneuron, and actually needs a branched interneuron, so that the response can go to multiple places. Because you need to do two things when you're withdrawing your foot. You need to pull up the foot that stepped down, and then shift your weight to the other foot. So you need all of your postural muscles and the muscles in the other leg to shift so that you can take that weight. That's all part of a reflex, but it's a much more complex reflex. So that would be a polysynaptic reflex. And that is the end of that. So thank you for staying tuned for reflex.